So 17 Republican senators just signed a letter calling for Donald Trump's resignation. Not an investigation, not censure. Resignation within 48 hours of the latest scandal breaking. Members of his own party walked away. The letter landed on Senate Majority Leader's desk at 9:47 a.m. Eastern on a Tuesday morning, and by noon, the Dow had dropped 847 points. Markets don't panic over political theater. Markets panic when the institutional framework of the American presidency starts to crack. And according to sources inside the Capitol, this isn't political posturing. This is the Republican Party preparing for constitutional succession because they believe the alternative is economic catastrophe. Warren Buffett broke his silence 3 hours after the letter became public. The Oracle of Omaha, who has spent 60 years avoiding political commentary, released a statement that cut through every talking point, every spin, every attempt at damage control. When the full faith and credit of the United States becomes a variable instead of a constant, every dollar held anywhere in the world loses value simultaneously. This isn't a political crisis. This is a currency crisis. In 94 years on this earth, Buffett has watched markets survive wars, recessions, and presidential scandals. He has never, not once, tied political instability directly to the debasement of American currency. Until now. When you hear what actually happened behind closed doors in the 48 hours before that letter was signed, when you understand the specific financial mechanisms that are already triggering automated sell-offs across global markets, when you see the private communications between foreign central banks and the Federal Reserve, you'll understand why seasoned political operatives on both sides are calling this the collapse of institutional credibility. This isn't about impeachment proceedings or constitutional lawyers debating high crimes. This is about whether the United States remains a stable jurisdiction for capital. Hit subscribe because the compounding pressure is accelerating by the hour, and this story is far from over. Let me walk you through how we got here. Because this didn't come out of nowhere. For the past 11 months, since Trump's return to office, financial markets have operated under what economists call stress tolerance. Every controversial policy, every inflammatory statement, every norm violation was absorbed by institutional systems designed to withstand political turbulence. The Federal Reserve maintained credibility. Treasury auctions continued without disruption. The dollar remained the global reserve currency not because of presidential competence, but because of institutional resilience. Markets believed the system could outlast the man. That calculus shifted 3 weeks ago. According to sources familiar with internal Republican caucus discussions, a closed-door meeting between Senate leadership and the Treasury Secretary revealed something that never made it into public statements. The Treasury had run preliminary models on what happens if presidential credibility deteriorates past a specific threshold. Not impeachment itself, but the sustained uncertainty, the constitutional ambiguity, the global perception that American governance has become unpredictable. The models showed pension fund exposure levels that made senior senators physically pale. We're talking about 401 kilobits account values tied to Treasury bond stability. We're talking about retiree portfolios built on the assumption that U.S. sovereign debt is risk-free. That assumption, those models suggested, was no longer holding. The specific scandal that triggered the 17-senator letter remains partially classified, but enough has leaked to understand why it crossed a line that previous controversies didn't. This wasn't about policy. This wasn't about tweets or press conferences. According to multiple officials from both parties, this involved direct communication with the foreign government regarding U.S. debt obligations. The details are still being verified, but the allegations center on promises made, commitments offered. Financial arrangements discussed that fall so far outside presidential authority that constitutional scholars are using words like automatic impeachment and unambiguous high crime. What most Americans don't realize is that foreign governments hold $7 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. $7 trillion. That's not an investment in American policy. That's an investment in American institutional stability. It's a bet that no matter who occupies the presidency, the foundational mechanisms of governance remain intact. The moment a president treats those mechanisms as negotiable, as instruments of personal leverage, that $7 trillion foundation starts to shake. And when Treasury securities shake, everything built on top of them, mortgages, corporate bonds, state pensions, student loans, every financial instrument priced off the risk-free rate collapses. For Republican senators facing re-election in 18 months, the choice became binary. Defend a president whose actions are triggering automated sell-offs in their constituents' retirement accounts, or cut him loose before the damage becomes generational. According to leaked text messages between senators, the exact phrase used was, "We're choosing between our party and our economy." 17 of them chose the economy. The letter they drafted wasn't political theater, it was crisis management. The room where the final decision was made sits on the third floor of the Russell Senate Office Building. It's not one of the ceremonial spaces where press conferences happen. It's a functional conference room with fluorescent lighting, a table that seats 24, and windows that overlook Constitution Avenue. There are no portraits on the walls, no flags, no cameras. This is where Senate leadership conducts business they don't want. Recorded, 21 Republican senators walked into that room at 7:15 p.m. on a Monday night. According to sources who were present, nobody sat down immediately. Several stood by the windows. Others remained near the door. The Senate Majority Leader arrived last, carrying a single folder. He placed it on the table and said, "The Treasury Secretary called me 2 hours ago. I'm going to read you exactly what she said, and then we're going to vote." The folder contained a 2-page memo from the Treasury. Not a policy recommendation, not a political analysis. A liquidity warning. The memo outlined what happens in the 72 hours following a presidential credibility event that crosses into constitutional crisis territory. First, foreign central banks begin unwinding Treasury positions. Not all at once. That would be too obvious, too destabilizing. But systematically, methodically, reducing exposure to U.S. sovereign debt. The memo included preliminary data showing this process had already begun. In the previous 11 days, foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries had decreased by $47 billion. $47 billion in 11 days. The senators who had been standing sat down. According to sources in the room, the Majority Leader read the entire memo aloud. When he finished, the room was silent for 41 seconds. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody whispered to aides. One senator later described it as the moment the political crisis became an economic emergency. The conversation that followed wasn't about Trump's guilt or innocence. It wasn't about constitutional procedure or impeachment mechanics. It was about timeline. How long before foreign central banks move from quiet unwinding to active divestment? How long before pension fund managers start rebalancing away from U.S. sovereign debt? How long before the global financial system interprets American political chaos as default risk? The Treasury memo estimated 14 to 18 days before market movements become irreversible. That meeting took place on a Monday night. The letter calling for resignation was drafted by Thursday morning, delivered by Tuesday, 11 days inside the window. The actual language of the letter went through 4 drafts. The first version, written by a group of 3 senators, used careful diplomatic phrasing about constitutional concerns and institutional obligations. The second draft, rewritten after consultation with legal counsel, became more direct. The third version, edited by senators with military and intelligence backgrounds, included classified addendums that won't be declassified for 30 years. The final version, the one delivered to the Majority Leader's desk at 9:47 a.m., contained 143 words. It cited no specific scandal. It referenced no investigation. It simply stated that continued presidential tenure represented an unacceptable risk to national economic security and requested immediate resignation in the interest of market stability. 17 senators signed it. According to sources familiar with the internal caucus count, 9 others wanted to sign but were persuaded to hold back as a strategic reserve. If Trump refuses and markets deteriorate further, those 9 signatures convert the letter from a request into a formal ultimatum. The political calculation was surgical. 17 signatures demonstrate seriousness without triggering immediate constitutional crisis. 26 signatures would force immediate succession procedures. The difference between 17 and 26 is the difference between pressure and coup. The White House received the letter at 9:52 a.m., 5 minutes after it landed on the Senate Majority Leader's desk. It was hand-delivered to the West Wing by a senior senator who refused to use intermediaries. According to officials present, the senator walked directly into the Oval Office without announcement, placed the letter on the resolute desk, and said, "This is not a negotiation." Then he left it. The entire interaction lasted 23 seconds. What happened in the 90 minutes after that delivery remains partially obscured, but enough is leaked to reconstruct the chaos. The president's first call was to his personal legal team. His second call was to the Republican National Committee chairman. His third call was to a major donor who also happens to sit on the board of one of the largest private equity firms in the world. That donor, according to sources, told the president something that no legal advisor or political operative could. Your legal exposure is irrelevant. Your political survival is irrelevant. If foreign central banks start dumping treasuries in volume, American household wealth drops by $30 trillion in 6 months. Nobody survives that. Not you, not your party, not the economy. You need to understand what we're dealing with. By 11:30 a.m., the Dow had dropped 847 points. By 1:15 p.m., it had recovered 492 points after rumors circulated that the president was considering the resignation request seriously. By market close, it had dropped again, settling down 681 points for the day. The volatility wasn't random. High-frequency trading algorithms programmed to detect political instability signals were triggering automatic sell-offs every time new information suggested constitutional uncertainty. Markets weren't reacting to Trump himself. They were reacting to the possibility that the institutional framework undergirding American capital markets might not survive his. Behind closed doors, the response from the White House fractured along two lines. Political advisors argued that resignation under pressure from his own party would be legacy suicide, that Trump should fight, force impeachment proceedings, turn it into a political spectacle he could control. Economic advisors presented data showing that every day of sustained uncertainty costs the U.S. economy $14 billion in capital flight, $14 billion per day. Not in theoretical future impact. In real-time withdrawals from money market funds, Treasury auctions seeing reduced international participation, corporate debt offerings being pulled because pricing models no longer work when the risk-free rates stop being risk-free. According to leaked communications, one economic advisor presented the president with a single number: $47 billion in 11 days. At current velocity, we hit $400 billion in 90 days. At $400 billion, the Fed loses control of interest rates. At that point, we're in uncharted territory. The president reportedly asked what uncharted territory meant. The advisor responded, "It means we find out whether the US dollar remains the global reserve currency." Public statements from both sides started within hours. The White House released a brief comment calling the letter partisan theater and affirming the president's commitment to finishing his term. The 17 senators released a joint statement through the Majority Leader's office. It contained 2 sentences. "Our letter stands. We await response. No press conference. No cable news appearances. No spin. The brevity was intentional. Long explanations look defensive. 2 sentences look final." Privately, according to sources within the Republican caucus, the 17 senators began preparing for 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, Trump resigns within 72 hours, markets stabilize, succession is clean. Scenario 2, Trump refuses, markets continue deteriorating, the 9 reserve senators add their signatures, constitutional crisis accelerates. Scenario 3, Trump attempts to purge Senate leadership or rally his base against the Republican establishment. The party fractures entirely, and the 2026 midterms become a bloodbath. International reaction came faster than domestic response. The European Central Bank issued a statement at 4 p.m. Eastern, 7 hours after the letter became public, The statement made no reference to American politics. It simply announced a routine review of reserve currency allocation models scheduled to conclude in 45 days. Routine reviews don't get announced with specific timelines unless they're not routine. According to sources familiar with ECB internal discussions, that announcement was coordinated with the German finance ministry and represented preparation for a scenario where the euro becomes a more stable reserve asset than the dollar. Japan's Ministry of Finance held an emergency overnight session. No official statement was released, but currency traders noted unusual activity in yen-dollar markets starting at 11 p.m. Tokyo time. The pattern suggested institutional repositioning, not speculative trading. Someone with access to large capital pools was reducing dollar exposure. South Korea's central bank governor gave a scheduled speech the following morning and added an unscripted paragraph about the importance of diversified reserve holdings in times of institutional uncertainty. The diplomatic language was careful. The meaning was clear. China said nothing publicly. But according to U.S. intelligence officials monitoring Chinese financial communications, internal directives went out from the People's Bank of China to major state-owned banks regarding U.S. Treasury exposure. The exact content remains classified, but the market impact was measurable. Chinese institutions hold approximately $1 trillion in U.S. debt. In the 48 hours following the 17th Senator letter, Chinese Treasury holdings dropped by $8 billion. Not a fire sale. A calculated reduction. Warren Buffett's full statement came 3 hours after the letter became public, but the analysis behind it had been developing for weeks. According to sources close to Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett had been in direct communication with Treasury officials since the scandal first emerged. Not about politics, about markets, specifically about what happens when the full faith and credit of the United States becomes conditional on the personal credibility of one man. His public statement was 68 words. His private analysis, shared with a small group of institutional investors, was 11 pages. The core argument was simple. Currency stability is not a political variable. It's a mathematical function of institutional credibility. When investors price sovereign debt, they're not betting on individual leaders. They're betting on systems. You don't invest in the President of the United States, Buffett told a closed-door gathering of fund managers. You invest in the Constitution, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the institutional continuity that survives presidential transitions. The moment a president treats those institutions as personal instruments, as tools to be leveraged for individual benefit, the mathematical function breaks down. Buffett drew a parallel to something that happened in 1971. Not Watergate. Something earlier, less remembered, but economically more significant. In August 1971, President Nixon ended dollar convertibility to gold. It was called the Nixon shock, and it fundamentally restructured the global monetary system overnight. But here's what most people forget. Markets didn't panic because Nixon explained the institutional logic. He framed it as a necessary evolution of the Bretton Woods system, executed through proper Treasury and Federal Reserve channels. It was a massive policy shift, but it was institutionally coherent. Markets could price it. What we're seeing now, Buffett explained, is the opposite. We're seeing institutional incoherence. When a president acts outside the constitutional framework on matters directly touching currency credibility, markets can't price that. How do you model the risk of a president who doesn't understand that his actions affect Treasury auction demand? You can't. So you exit the position. In 67 years of professional investing, Buffett said he'd never seen a scenario where the institutional credibility of the United States was the variable in the equation. The economic translation is brutal. U.S. household wealth in aggregate is roughly $140 trillion. Approximately $38 trillion of that is directly or indirectly tied to the assumption that U.S. Treasury securities are risk-free. When that assumption breaks, when international investors start treating American sovereign debt like emerging market debt, the repricing is automatic. It's not a political choice. It's a mathematical recalibration. Every pension fund, every insurance company, every endowment, every sovereign wealth fund, every institution that holds long-term capital has models that assume us. Treasuries anchor the risk-free rate. When the anchor moves, everything reprices. Buffett's 11-page analysis included projections. If foreign central banks continue unwinding Treasury positions at current velocity, U.S. 10-year yields increase by 47 basis points within 6 months. That sounds technical. In practical terms, it means mortgage rates jump, corporate borrowing costs surge, federal deficit financing becomes more expensive, and state and local governments face budget crises because their pension obligations are calculated against Treasury yields. The compounding effect hits middle-class Americans harder than anyone else because their wealth is disproportionately concentrated in home equity and retirement accounts, both of which are directly tied to interest rates. The devastating verdict in Buffett's analysis came on page 9. This is not a recession scenario. Recessions happen when demand drops. This is a balance sheet recession. Balance sheet recessions happen when asset values collapse faster than debt can be reduced. American households are leveraged against the assumption that their homes and retirement accounts hold stable value. If Treasury repricing triggers a broad asset deflation event, household debt doesn't decrease. Household assets do. The gap between what Americans owe and what they own becomes unbridgeable. In 70 years of investing through every market cycle, Buffett noted, he had never seen a political crisis create the conditions for balance sheet recession. Until now, the philosophical authority came through in Buffett's closing paragraph. In 94 years, I've watched America survive wars, scandals, impeachments, and constitutional crises. The system has always held because institutions were stronger than individuals. What concerns me now is the possibility that we reached a point where one individual's refusal to recognize institutional limits can damage the system faster than the system can repair itself. Markets price that possibility in real time. We're watching it happen. The cascading consequences are already in motion, and they're following a sequence that economic models predicted but political observers didn't want to believe. Start with the immediate economic layer. $47 billion in foreign treasury sales in 11 days becomes the new baseline. If constitutional uncertainty persists, that number accelerates at current velocity. The United States faces $400 billion in capital outflow within 90 days. $400 billion is the threshold where the Federal Reserve loses passive control of interest rates and must begin active intervention. That intervention takes the form of the Fed buying treasuries that foreign central banks are selling, which means the Fed expands its balance sheet, which means dollar dilution, which means inflation pressure, which means the Fed faces an impossible choice between defending the currency and defending treasury markets. The political layer compounds immediately. Republican senators facing re-election in 2026 are watching their constituents' 401 kilobits balances decline in real time. Every point drop in the Dow translates to household wealth destruction in their districts. According to polling data that remains private but has been shared with Senate leadership, voter anger over retirement account losses exceeds voter anger over any policy issue by a factor of 4 to 1. These senators aren't making a moral judgment about Trump. They're making a mathematical calculation about political survival. If markets continue deteriorating, the electoral cost of defending Trump exceeds the cost of forcing him out. The defense and intelligence layers where institutional erosion becomes strategic vulnerability. The United States maintains global military presence and alliance structures based on economic credibility. When the dollar weakens, when treasury markets become unstable, when American institutional credibility becomes questionable, allies start hedging. Not dramatically, not with public announcements, but systematically. According to classified briefings shared with the Senate Armed Services Committee, 5 major allies have initiated quiet reviews of their defense procurement dependence on American suppliers. The concern isn't military capability. The concern is financial stability. If the U.S. enters a prolonged economic crisis triggered, a layer of consequence accelerates the others. Economic instability drives political fracture. Political fracture undermines defense credibility. Defense credibility erosion creates international opportunity for adversaries. Adversary advancement increases American economic vulnerability. The cycle feeds itself. and breaking it requires something that seems increasingly impossible: institutional coherence at a moment when institutions are under maximum stress. What we're watching is not a typical political crisis with a clear resolution path. We're watching the moment when 17 Republican senators looked at economic models, consulted with Treasury officials, reviewed foreign central bank activity, and concluded that defending their president was less important than defending the dollar. That calculation, that choice, represents a threshold crossing that hasn't happened in American political history. Congress has impeached presidents. Congress has forced resignations. But Congress has never abandoned a sitting president of their own party purely on economic stability grounds. The $47 billion in foreign treasury sales, the 847-point market drop, the 17 senators who signed a letter asking their party's president to resign, the $400 billion threshold that triggers Fed intervention. These aren't just numbers. They're the load-bearing elements of a system under stress test conditions it was never designed to withstand. Warren Buffett, who has spent 94 years watching American resilience absorb every shock history could deliver, is now openly questioning whether the system can survive institutional incoherence at the presidential level. This isn't about impeachment hearings or constitutional lawyers debating high crimes. This is about whether the global financial system continues to price U.S. sovereign debt as risk-free. It's about whether American households can retire on the portfolios they built over 40 years of work. It's about whether the dollar remains the reserve currency that underwrites American global power. And right now, in Treasury markets, in foreign central bank reserve allocation decisions, in pension fund stress tests, the answer to those questions is no longer automatic. The full faith and credit of the United States has become conditional. Markets are repricing that reality in real time. And 17 Republican senators just decided that their president is the liability they can't afford to carry. The question now is not whether Trump survives politically. The question is whether American institutional credibility survives, regardless of what Trump does next, because the damage is already compounding. The repricing is already happening. The international perception that American governance has become unreliable is already embedded in capital allocation decisions being made in Berlin, Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing. Reversing that perception requires years of sustained institutional stability. And every day that the current crisis continues makes that reversal exponentially harder. We're in the window. 14 to 18 days, the Treasury memo said. 11 days have already passed. The clock is running, and the cost of every hour is measured in billions of dollars of capital leaving American markets. In basis points added to Treasury yields, in household wealth destroyed, in alliance credibility eroded, in adversary confidence built, the system that held for 248 years is being stress tested in ways it was never designed to. What happens next will determine whether American institutional resilience was permanent or whether it was always contingent on leaders choosing to respect the limits that made it resilient in the first place.